NIL was the story of media days after Texas Tech signed big five-star prospect Felix Ojo, but two other five-star prospects are in this conference. Let's talk about them.
You are Locked On College Crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to a crossover edition of Locked On, actually in both instances, Cougars in a weird way. I'm host of Locked On Coogs with two O's, Parker Ainsworth, the Houston Cougars. Jake Hatch joins me, the Locked On BYU Cougars. So does that mean when you asked for candied popcorn at Big 12 Media Days, did you get the blue boxes? I got red, and it kind of freaked. Red popcorn was not my jam, Jake.
Unfortunately, I did get red popcorn as well, despite my pleas for blue popcorn. So, nonetheless, I think we need to term this it's a Tuesday Cougs Day, right? Is that what we're going with here?
Tuesday Cougs Day, all things Houston Cougars, BYU Cougars, talking about the Big 12. And I know Kansas State is doing Farmageddon Fridays. I totally get the vibe here. But we're coming off of Big 12 Media Days where NIL dominated conversation. So we've got to at least talk about that in the first segment. Other Big 12 media kind of stuff in the second segment as well, because there were other things, 5+11, all kinds of that stuff. And then both sets of Cougars have been killing it in the recruiting atmosphere. And so I want to make sure I talk to you some about that because I'm intrigued by what's going on there in Provo. But in Frisco, outside of some bad Wi-Fi, Jake Hatch, the conversation about how to pay players, and I think our two schools operate in a fairly similar way in some regards and a fairly different way in others. Sitake had some interesting things to say about it.
Well, that's the thing about this is that BYU has been very clear that they want to be in the mix when it comes to NIL. And we've seen that, obviously, with their notoriety, if you want to call it that, with the AJ DeBonsa story, especially in basketball. But in football, they've also been making waves with their ability to bring in some high-level talent and accusations. They've been using NIL as a part of that. I think the bigger thing is Kalani Sitake. They've been very clear that despite what one booster said at one point, you know this, Parker, there was a booster that told Myron Medcalf from ESPN, "We won't be outbid," was the quote about BYU.
Which is a baller quote for what it's worth.
Here's the thing about this. I don't get why, but BYU's brain trust, I'm talking Kalani Sitake, Brian Santiago, the new athletic director, et cetera, they're trying to like tamp that down, saying, "Oh, we're not this." It's like, you know what? Just embrace it. You got boosters who want to make you guys a difference maker when it comes to recruiting. I would try and steer right into it if I was BYU, but I also understand them being a faith-based institution. They don't necessarily want to come off as that ostentatious.
Well, and there's like some greed elements to that, the deadly sins and what I totally get that. But also the Baptist University in this conference wore a t-shirt saying we play payers.
Yeah.
I messed that up. We pay players to their spring practices. I think that there's just two different ways to go about it. Like you're saying, leaning in is interesting. I do think though that Sitake kind of set the forefront of a handful of coaches that said the biggest thing is like some guidelines would be great, right? Like basic rules would be awesome because right now they're playing a game that the rules kind of get made up as we go. Like all of a sudden, these NIL deals are going through Deloitte if they're filed before this day, but not after that day.
Well, and then, by the way, you probably saw this past weekend, we already have the CSC under fire for a bunch of these deals getting nixed if they're mixed up with a collective. And there's already threats of legal action on that front. So, yeah, they may want guardrails in place, Parker, but in some instances, it feels like the guardrails may be falling off just as soon as we try and put them on.
Yeah, you Freudian slip there because they might actually want God on their side because people are gonna. If you say I can't pay my player, you're gonna get sued. You might want some real good defense like that good book might give you. Now, I do feel like though, like the idea of some basic rule, and I'm actually anti-salary cap, anti-draft. This is not a pro sports show, so we don't have to get into all that. some basic rules would be nice.
Well, here's the thing. If they need, okay, if they really want, as Deion Sanders says, Coach Prime says he wants a salary cap in college football. Well, I think Coach Prime is smart enough to realize that you're not able to have a salary cap or have any sort of that type of structure without what they call a collective bargaining agreement. But the problem is, if you're not going to declare these players actual employees of your university, which is something the NCAA is like, oh, it's a hiss and a byword. Like we are not about that life. That's only going to cause bigger issues, because until you have some structure in terms of having both universities and athletes coming to the bargaining table and talking about this and setting a framework out, Parker, I just don't see a good way forward that doesn't include a bunch of lawyers suing somebody, whether it's the CSC, the NCAA, transfer portal, insert university name here, and just making oodles and oodles of money as they break every rule, it seems like, it tries to be put in place.
I don't mean to be total history teacher here, Jake. And I will say a big start of college football season kind of day is Labor Day. And you probably look up what that means for some folks that don't. But what's the biggest problem with the players being employees? Is it that we have to give them workers' rights and workers' comp? I mean, like, that doesn't, call me crazy, that doesn't seem so bad to me.
Okay, here's the thing. I look at it, I'm with you, because you think about it, it shouldn't be that hard, but you think about it, it's millions of dollars that's going to have to be invested in athletes that, outside of football and men's basketball, many universities, they don't simply bring revenue to the university, and you're having to put workers' compensation type insurance in place. You're having to obviously put rights in the laps of these players that cost you a lot of money if you're a university. So I see both sides of it, but if these universities legitimately want something to be worked out outside of the United States Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, putting a framework together themselves, which very well may not work in their best interest, speaking of universities, outside of that, they need to come to the table and talk with these players and either, declare them employees or try and find some structure that all sides can agree to outside of a handshake and a promise that, hey, we won't sue you. It's like, come on now.
Given everyone at the podium's career before coaching, because Willie Fritz played lower level football once upon a time, and I assume Sitake, he's a giant. He played at some point.
Yeah. Kalani grew up a BYU guy, got to play for Lavelle Edwards at BYU as a starting fullback during his time as a Cougar, and then it got into coaching after that. A bunch of these coaches, there's very few anymore at the Division I/Power 4 level who weren't former football athletes themselves.
Not a whole lot of Mike Leaches out there. And for what it's worth, the fullback, that makes the neck make more sense for Sitake. But Coach Prime, insinuating that players should take less money so we have a salary cap, is rich. The famous quote, the thing I associate with the most of Deion Sanders is he said that the Dallas Cowboys were going to have to put him on layaway. They owed him so much money. I cannot believe that's the guy. That can't be right, Jake. That can't be right.
It doesn't sound right, but that's what we got from him during his session there in Frisco. And trust me, I was as floored as anybody, because you're right. This is a guy that once upon a time, he was among the highest paid athletes in his sport. Speaking of football, he's also a professional baseball player. It's kind of funny to see him on the other side of it, arguing for salary cap and the like.
Baseball, there is no salary. One of his two careers.
Sure, but there's luxury tax and whatnot. And baseball owners have threatened putting a salary cap in place, but it'll never actually happen. But it's just kind of rich to see a guy who was once upon a time an athlete trying to get every single nickel he could out of every team he played for, now calling for programs like his own to have a cap that they can't exceed in terms of paying their athletes.
That, and then Scott Frost commenting he learned not to take the wrong job when he left for big money, but now doesn't want his players to leave for money. Doesn't make it, just all these contradictions around this money thing.
And like I said, whenever there's money involved, everybody wants what's theirs, if that makes sense. And here's the thing. Scott Frost can say that, but if anyone of his athletes really look at his comments and then say, hey, coach, you're going to tell me I'm supposed to play for the love of the game? He's like, well, I played for the love of the game. It's like, yeah, coach, but guess what? During your day, you probably were thinking, hey, I should be making some money. This is a multi-billion-dollar business, Parker. We all know this. The entities that be, whether it's the NCAA, the conferences themselves, the coaches, they're all getting theirs in terms of the money. So I'm actually all for athletes getting what they can get. And it's baffling to me. You have these coaches sit up there, as you said, mentioning to Scott Frost saying, well, yeah, these guys shouldn't be chasing the money. It's like, dude, you'd be chasing the money right along everybody else if you were given that opportunity, even during your playing days at Nebraska.
Let me know what charity you donated that Nebraska check to, because it wasn't the winning games charity. All right, I want to talk more about, a lot more was talked about at Big 12 Media Days than just dollars and cents. Before we get to any of that, I want to save you some dollars and cents with the buddies over at Game Time, because we've all been there. It's logging in early, waiting forever for concert tickets or the comedy show. You're trying to take someone on a nice date, whatever the case may be, just to lose your spot in line for that thing you've been dying to see. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping. And that's where Game Time comes in. Game Time makes getting concert tickets, comedy shows, whatever you're doing around Houston, Provo, the greater Salt Lake, whatever you're doing, easier than ever. Prices actually drop as it gets closer to showtime. You can actually save up to 60% off with their killer last minute deals. I personally like knowing at that venue for the type of event what it looks like from that section and row on the app. No hidden fees either. Jake, anything you like about the Game Time app?
Well, I can just tell you this much. I know the Utah Jazz struggled this past year, but I got some pretty sweet deals on Jazz tickets. I'll just say that this past season.
Fair. It might not be as sweet in the coming years, but last season it worked. You could take the guys we're going to buying tickets and show up at the game with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Lounge tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. Jake, going into that, there were a lot of other things at Big 12 Media Days, and I was kind of taken aback by the clear 17-person push for the 5+11 model in the college football playoff. It felt like all 16 coaches and Brett Yormark had a meeting on Monday night, like, hey, we're pushing this idea. And I like it on the surface. I think it's fair. I think it's long-term. I think it's futuristic planning. 5 teams, the 5 conference champions, 4 Power 4, and then a group of 5 champion. And then the other 11 out of a 16-team playoff gets to be picked at large. And as the other option would be like having 4 from this conference, 4 from that conference, 2, right, or whatever, and kind of pre-slotting it. The argument, I think there were several being made, but was basically like, this is the most fair, earn it on the field. Jake, were you kind of taken aback by how hard they were pressing that all week?
No, I wasn't, and it's because of this. Here's the deal. If you agreed to that 4-4-2-2-2 model that has been proposed by the Big Ten, most notably, the SEC has said, hey, they'll go with the 5+11 because the SEC knows they'll get their fair share of teams in if it goes to that model. But if you pre-sort, you mentioned kind of pre-slot these teams, it only hurts the Big 12. So, yeah, they probably had talking points legitimately handed to them from the Big 12 conference. Brett Yormark's team, I'm sure, told the coaches, hey, this is what we're going to be pushing this week, because if you don't play that hand, well, you're just admitting defeat in many respects. So I completely understand why BYU and every other conference team, as well as Brett Yormark as Big 12 commissioner, push that 5+11 model, because you got to hope that you can get that model in place and then by some small miracle go out there and make enough impressions, whether it's the Houston Cougars, the BYU Cougars, the other 14 teams in this conference, that you can find a way to get 2 or 3 teams into that mix annually. It may be hard pressed to think about getting 4 teams in, but to have the hope of being there, that's why they were pushing it so hard. Because if you just admit, hey, you're getting half of the field to the Big Ten and the SEC, that's playing with a losing hand and just simply saying, throwing your cards on the table saying, we give up.
Well, and we all know that once Keisean Henderson for Houston and Ryder Lyons for BYU show up, that we'll be 1 and 2 in that showing. Right. I think the real interesting thing to me is that if you went 1-16 last year under the 5+11 model, you would have only had 1 Big 12 team in, and that at least with the 2, you get a guaranteed second and all of that. I do think having that written into the plans for a long-term thing would have been a problem. I worry about these like speed bumps or learning curves along the way, because until we have that dominant team, which Brett Yormark mentioned we want in the Big 12, we can talk about that too if you'd like. Until we have that, you kind of don't have the horses. Like from a media coverage perspective. People didn't know to look at Arizona State until pretty late in the season. Your BYU Cougars probably suffered from that as well, where people looked up in week 9, 10, 11, like, oh, we should have been watching them all year.
Well, that's the thing about this. I can tell you, BYU's players in particular, they were irate. I think it was like week 7 or 8. They were undefeated. They're in the top 15 nationally, Parker. It may have been even week 9. I don't think it was, but they went to UCF. They went to Orlando. UCF at the time was sub 500, and somehow, some way, the odds makers, our friends at FanDuel, etc., made BYU an underdog to the UCF Knights. And I can tell you that was a slap in the face of the BYU Cougars, but also pointed exactly to your point that the nation wasn't necessarily sitting up and paying attention to the Big 12. And in that case, BYU, you mentioned Arizona State. We're going to have some name brands really emerge here, whether that's a Texas Tech with all the money they're throwing around in NIL. If BYU can capitalize on AJ DeBonsa in basketball and Ryder Lyons in football, you mentioned Keisean Henderson for Houston. You need to have these top dogs, and we're talking top players involved. They have to make impressions nationally and force the nation to pay attention to the Big 12. That's much easier said than done because we all know that the networks, they're in bed. Speaking of Fox with the Big 10 and ESPN with the SEC, all you got to do if you're BYU and Houston and the rest of the Big 12, you have to force them to pay attention to you, and you got to do that early on in the season. So that may require, and Kalani Sitake talked about this, I'll get your thought on this. He proposed that Power 4 programs only play other Power 4 programs. He said we play 9 conference games. We play 1 against an ACC, 1 against an SEC, and 1 against a Big 10 opponent, and that fills out our 12-game allotment. If that were to come to fruition, that's going to create some really big-time matchups for the Big 12. Will it happen? I don't think so, but I think that could be a thing that could help brands in the Big 12 make an impression early on in the season and force eyeballs their way.
I think you could at least press for 2 of the 3. Personally, I like Houston Rice. I do like the idea that Houston gets to play Rice across town, and Rice will, unfortunately, they can get mad at me on the comment section if they want to. Rice is not going to be a Power 4 program. They're just not, right? I do feel like, I guess, an old, American Athletic Conference rivalry, Houston might have been Memphis, and maybe they will be or whatever. But I could see 2 of the 3 being basically like you get an SEC and a Big 10, or an ACC and an SEC, right, or whatever. Because, for instance, last year, Houston, one of their best air quotes wins was actually a loss to Oklahoma when they played them super close. Mm-hmm. And people are like, oh my God, like Houston's defense is for real. They held that Oklahoma offense to 16 points. And frankly, had Arizona State versus Texas been in week 3, we might have paid attention to them all year long, right? And Houston's got I'm sorry to cut you, but Houston's got LSU scheduled for 2027. Having a second game against, Michigan or against Nebraska or something in the same setting would do a lot of favors for Houston in the national perspective.
Well, and that's the thing that I look at it. There's people that say, hey, BYU's playing Stanford this year. I'm like, Stanford's awful. Like, there's going to be the years where you would play an ACC team in this case like a Stanford, but they may be the worst Power 4 team in the entire country. So, yeah, there will still be some of those dog games because these programs find themselves beaten down at times. But more often than not, you need to find a way to get high-profile matchups. And you mentioned the fact like an LSU for Houston. That's awesome. I wish BYU had something like that on the books in the near future. And there's some teams out there that they're scheduled to play, but there needs to be more of those. I think FCS versus FBS games are just a waste of everybody's time. I've advocated for a long time to do away with them. I get why they exist. I've actually argued they should be your spring game. Speaking of college football, make that the end of your spring camp and you still get the money to the FCS program, but actually get an actual game in the mix. But that's another story for another day. I just look at it. Yes, you need to have high profile matchups. And I think you're smart. Maybe make it, at least you have a requirement to schedule at least 2 of the other conferences. And then you keep that one slot open. Cause I know the BYU would like to play the likes, maybe a Utah State or a Boise State every so often to mix it up a little bit.
Well, and Boise State would be quite an impressive group of 6 team. I think the other thing is that I'd want to make sure the other power conferences are doing it too.
Sure.
Because if you took 2 losses there, suddenly the Big 12 schools are taking a bunch of losses that, Alabama plays Mercer every year. Like it's a little bit different, right? And I want to make sure that we're just all playing the same game from that instance. And I think would be important in this.
Well, and that's the thing about that. You would need to get everybody on board. And the problem is, do you see the SEC, the Big 10 getting on board with that? I have a hard time believing it. But if a guy, here's the thing. we heard a bunch of the coaches, Kalani, Sitake. I know that Coach Prime said it. Willie Fritz may have said it. They're saying that Brett Yormark's the best commissioner in all of college sports. It feels like if there's one guy that can kind of prevail on people to make something like this a reality, are you going to put it past Brett Yormark to force it and make it reality, Parker? Because I really don't think I could.
No, and I will say too, for whatever it's worth, that there's a lot of teams you could play in the Big 12 and the ACC that are better than Mississippi State, right? Like,
Well, sure.
like
Yeah. Here's the thing: every conference is going to have their dog programs in that conference, and that it just simply exists. But the nice part is, if you can find those annual matchups every so often, where you've got a top program versus a top program, and hope that the Big 12 prevails in those programs, that gets those eyeballs early on in the season on the Big 12 conference that hopefully linger for the rest of the year, and hopefully a program like a Houston or a BYU, if they're so lucky in that circumstance, can make a run that the entire nation can say, oh yeah, okay, BYU or Houston, they did really some impressive stuff. And that's where you find kind of that traction with the 5+11 model to find yourself with extra teams in the playoff.
as we move into segment 3, making a run is going to require a quarterback. And both of our programs in terms of recruiting class 2026 have found that. Ryder Lyons, 5-star quarterback heading to the BYU Cougars. Keisean Henderson, 5-star quarterback heading to the Houston Cougars. We can debate who's better when they're playing in Big 12 championship games down the road, Jake. That's a later episode. As far as this goes, it feels like both teams and programs are like constructing entire classes around these quarterbacks and their personas. Houston added a couple of 4-star receivers over the weekend, is looking to add a big fella this week. We'll see if that ends up coming through or not. BYU, I know, has done the same. You can tell us how exactly.
Well, so here's the thing. I can tell you. So Ryder Lyons, obviously, he's the kind of the centerpiece of BYU's recruiting class, which is in the top 20 nationally. And that's where BYU wants to be annually, if at all possible. But last night, not last night, 2 nights ago, I should say, you had a Jax Tanner out of Idaho, Rocky Mountain High School in near the Boise area. He's a 4-star offensive lineman, commits to BYU. Guess why he committed to BYU in large part? He says that Ryder Lyons was pushing him to commit. Well, hey, shocking. A star quarterback wants a road grader offensive lineman in front of him? Absolutely. Guys like Keisean Henderson and Ryder Lyons, when you get them committed to your program and they buy fully in with those commitments, they completely change the perception of how these two programs, speaking of Houston and BYU, have gone about recruiting. They're putting together absolutely dynamic 2026 recruiting classes. I've got no problem saying right now, should things hold for BYU, this will be the best recruiting class in program history. And the hope is that down the line with the Ryder Lyons at quarterback, etc., that it'll pay off in spades, as you mentioned, with maybe some Big 12 title game appearances, championships, and maybe a college football playoff berth or two. But that's the same hope for what Houston's doing right now as well, because these quarterbacks, when you get that type of athlete, other players want to sign up and play with them because they know the caliber of player that is.
Well, and Keyshawn's got some swag to him. His whole thing is about keeping Houstonians home, and he wears a raccoon skin cap to 7-on-7 all summer, and he shut down his recruitment to other places, and then came on his official visit to Houston on a weekend. They hosted a bunch of 4-star receivers, including these guys that just committed. Right, like I think it all ties together. He's like, hey, if you come here, I'm gonna be the one throwing you the ball. like
that's
a big deal.
Yeah, so BYU's got a 4-star tight end by the name of Brock Harris who could have gone anywhere in the entire country. He wanted to play with Ryder Lyons. He actually committed before Ryder and was a big part of trying to push Ryder to commit to BYU. But guys want to play together that have grown up playing in the same realm as these players because they know how good they are. But you're right. Guy like Keisean Henderson, he's going to be able to tell guys, hey, I'm going to be that guy under center. I'm going to be slinging to the rock. Come play with me. Ryder Lyons is doing the same thing at BYU, whether it's wide receivers, running backs, offensive linemen. He's telling guys, come be a part of this because we're going to change the perception of BYU nationally, and we're going to go out and win a lot, hopefully.
Well, and I guess what's interesting is like if we're projecting, whether we talk about the 5+11 model and how like it's going to take some getting the get a kind of build the Big 12 up as we get towards that. I mentioned Houston plays LSU in the early part of the season 2027. That would be Keyshawn's sophomore or redshirt freshman, depending how things go. I do feel like at least our two programs, and you can throw Texas Tech with their 5-star tackle in as well, are building this recruiting class in a way that's okay. If the deal is we're going to match those guys over in the SEC, those other Southerners, we're loading up. Let's do it because I don't think you can with Houston BYU, Texas Tech getting 5 stars, that argument like, well, they've got better players seems to kind of fall on its face, right? I mean, that's been the argument this whole time.
Yeah, no, the argument's been there the whole time, but you're right. It completely flies in the face of what the traditional tropes seem to be about. I look at it as BYU and Houston, they're getting some momentum right now. Now, on the recruiting trail, it's good to have momentum, but you know what helps that momentum stay in place? Winning. That's the thing about this. You got to go out and win with these guys. And yeah, Keisean Henderson, as soon as he gets to campus in Houston there, he's going to be a guy that people are going to be like, hey, when's he finally going to be the guy? A guy like Ryder Lyons, he is going on a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So he's going to be at least a year behind a guy like Keisean Henderson because he'll be more of the 2027 class before he ultimately enrolls. But as soon as they enroll, Parker, they've got to make impressions in terms of making impact on the field to keep that momentum alive.
And I guess that's the thing is like it just comes down to like now that you're getting the guys, they've got to stay and they've got to perform on the football field.
That's a great point. The retention point with the transfer portal, NIL, who knows what the future of that holds? You got to keep your guys in place. You can't have them come in, win that press conference, as they call it, with a recruiting win, and then have them walk out the door a year later. That just doesn't work.
Well, it certainly would be an abject failure on the system, and that's it. And I don't think I get that vibe from Keisean himself. I'm still getting to know the other kids that are committed in the class a little bit more. I do think though that you're starting to see those kind of things chip away at the armor that the SEC has had on at least the media version of this, because perception is such a big part of this. More picking polls, picking spots in a playoff, because it is at some point people in a room, right? Like it's hard to think about like BYU got left out last year because there were people in a room that chose someone else. And like they chose a team that BYU beat for what it's worth.
SMU.
ISMU, yeah. And I think that's shout out to our newest Locked On SMU show, by the way. A weird way to shout them out. I feel like you're just trying to like put stuff on paper for that conversation to be had, right?
Well,
BYU knows as well as anyone.
Yeah, that's the thing about it is you do need to make an impression with that. But I will say this, and I want to get your thought on this, is BYU is a program that's obviously built around the church culture, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Some of Houston followers probably know it better as the Mormon church. Either way, BYU recruits obviously to that. The honor code that's involved in that, the fact that it's a faith-based institution, that's what BYU kind of stands for. And I know that Houston, it's a secular school, but I love what Willie Fritz's messaging has been, similar to what Kalani Sitake talks about when it comes to the church and what BYU, it stands for more than just football. It stands, you're representing the church, this university. What I've loved about Willie Fritz, and I want your thought on this, is that he has said, hey, Houston is for Houstonians. Come be a part of your community school. And even though BYU is a faith-based institution, I feel like the messaging, whether it comes from the secular side for Houston or the more religious side for BYU, play into what you can highlight. And that's what Houston's doing, I think, with their recruiting class, saying, hey, come represent your hometown or the greater Houston area.
With the commitment Sunday night, Houston launches into the top half of the Big 12 in most rankings across the board. And they only have 14 commits thus far, looking at a few more for the end of July. I think they'll get a couple of those, but that is all to say Fritz's big claim to fame in recruiting class 2026 has been that he didn't have to take a plane. It's all been places he could drive to from the third ward, which is a neighborhood in Houston. And some of those are long drives. I mean, like Midland, Texas is 5 or 6 hours easily, if not longer. But I think that's an interesting way to go about it because Houston is a hot ground for Texas, A&M, Oklahoma, LSU. And he's like, no, let's just keep these kids here and like make it the Houston All-Star team. We'll be all right, and it's a pretty much like you're saying, like a representation of, in your case, a representation of character in the church. I think representation, not that there's lacking of character in the city of Houston, but representation of the region is equally powerful in a weird way.
It needs to be that. That's the thing about these two programs need to recruit to their strengths because there's other power programs out there that have SEC or Big Ten names next to them that are going to obviously have a draw to them. What Houston and BYU need to do is try and differentiate themselves with their own unique messaging. And I think both of them have been very smart about how they've gone about it recently.
Tuesday, Cougs Day wrapping up. But Jake, I don't mean to push about that whole Red Sox. The other Jake, we'll call him the other Jake. And what else you guys got going on? But you guys have a busy week at Locked On Cougars planned.
Yeah, we got a lot going on. Obviously, continuing to track the Jake Retzloff news as it comes in. He's officially withdrawn from BYU. Where does he end up next? We'll break that down. We're getting closer and closer to training camp beginning. We got big questions, as I like to call them, ahead of training camp that we're addressing. And yeah, recruiting, you're doing the same thing essentially. It feels like down there in Houston, Parker, because the recruiting for Houston, it stays red hot. It looks like.
Stays red hot. I will say, Connor Wegman, the quarterback. We know where some of the people are going to be to talk through previewing the season. Some too. Also got some guys that have watched the basketball side of things, and we're putting together 2026 class in basketball and all of that. So lots of things at Locked On Cougs as well. Find either Locked On Cougs or Locked On Cougars wherever you get your podcast. The latest things on the Cougars of BYU and Houston each and every day. And we can both say, "Go Cougs, go Cougs,
Go Coogs."